Here we are. Greetings and welcome to another edition of the Red Pill Diaries. I'm your host Rashid, and without further ado, let me bring in our very special guest, Professor Kevin Barrett. I got to say unto you, hopefully we don't have any technical issues. Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. It's good to be with you, Rashid. I apologize for the technical mistakes last week. I'm still getting used to the new way of communicating on the internet. I guess I'm an old timer.
Me too. Me too. I am. I have a lot of technical glitches too. My son is the tech guy, so he has to alert me to what to do here and what to do there. As a matter of fact, he's right behind the green screen right now, monitoring what's going on. Kevin, what do you? Let's just jump right into this main thing about the situation that is going on in Russia. I didn't report on it. I just watched things from the background, and I saw a lot of the popular channels and a lot of the pundits giving their analysis on what's going on with the Prigozhin saga with Russia. Before you chime in on it, here is something that was on my mind, and the reason I didn't make a lot of statements because things weren't adding up to me. They weren't adding up to me about the entire situation and the narrative that was going on about Prigozhin is this rebel contractor when we know that the what is it called the Wagner Group was started by Russian intelligence and so how can he be a figurehead and yet command the military branch of Wagner to overthrow the Russian government. And wasn't he Putin's chef at one time?
Yeah, he was right. Yeah, it's a really strange story. The guy started out as a hot dog vendor on the streets of Moscow and supposedly rose to become Putin's personal chef. And the next thing you know, he's running this Wagner militia group, which is sort of like the Russian Blackwater. And now he becomes a big war hero, and he wins the big battle for Bakhmut 2 weeks ago, and then suddenly he's leading some kind of rebellion. So there are all sorts of possibilities here. It's hard for us to know what's really going on. I don't have the security clearance to even hazard a guess as to what the people who think that they know what's going on are telling other people who think they know what's going on, in secret in special top secret memos and stuff. So I think those people are probably just guessing too. So who knows? I mean, it could be a typical sort of rivalry between different branches of the military. This is very common. Happens in wartime. George Patton, for example, the most successful American general in World War II, was murdered, almost certainly on the orders of the folks like Allen Dulles and what's his name, the guy who started the OSS, whose name is just escaping me at the moment. These guys ordered the murder of America's most accomplished World War II general because he was starting to get a little bit out of line and his power threatened their power. So it's common that you have these kinds of rivalries, and they sometimes do get solved with these mysterious deaths, like General Patton. His car, suddenly, as he approaches a roadblock, slows down. His window is stuck down, so he couldn't roll up his window even if he wanted to, and so he is shot with a special Eastern European manufactured weapon that smashes a rock against his head with incredible force, smashing his head in such a way that it's conceivable that it could have been caused by an automobile accident. It was shot by a guy who later confessed to the whole thing. And so, this is just one example of how you get these inter-service type rivalries. And it's like everybody knows, that sometimes, the Marines hate the Army, hate the Air Force, hate the CIA. We had Ed Snowden very likely working with people in the CIA to try to take the NSA down a peg or two. Very likely Snowden did have that inside help. That doesn't mean he's a bad guy. I kind of sympathize with the wing of the CIA that wanted to do that. But this happens in America too. And of course, our media covers it up. The murder of JFK was another example of a power faction struggle in the U.S. resolved by murder. But the difference here is that we cover it up. I mean, hardly anybody in America knows about the Patton assassination, what's really went on with Kennedy and so on. And so anyway, it's quite possible that Prigozhin, buoyed by his success in Bakhmut and angry at these other military commanders, and then resentful of the fact that he was going to have to register his guys with the Russian armed services, did protest. He mounted a protest. I wouldn't call it an armed insurrection exactly, because I don't think he fired on anybody really. But it was a sort of a protest and a quasi coup. It wasn't directed against Putin. He never said anything negative about Putin whatsoever. He was very careful not to. Instead, he was attacking the other military branches. So that's the kind of obvious, straightforward explanation. But then, there are all sorts of other possibilities. Some suspect that Prigozhin was working with the Americans and the Ukrainian proxies, that he was an American agent that had been promised something by, there's this wing of sort of treasonous fifth columnists in Russia. The fifth columnists are those loyal to liberal capitalism in the West. And then there's the sixth columnists, who are angry at Putin for not being tough enough. They want to basically nuke Kyiv, or at least flatten it. So Putin has been negotiating between all of these factions, and so one theory is that Prigozhin was working for the fifth columnists, who are the pro-Western forces, and that this was all about screwing up Russia's war effort, in fact, taking it down. And then another theory is that actually the whole thing was a big false flag, that Prigozhin was working with Putin, and that the whole purpose of that would have been to sort of flesh out the fifth and sixth columnists and I'll give Putin the emergency powers to do what he wants, to offer false hope to the Ukrainians and maybe bait them into stupid moves. So because now Putin comes out of it actually pretty strong. He does have that 70% popularity rating, vastly ahead of Biden or any American president in recent memory, or any memory. So it's still really unclear what really happened. And there are a million, there's an establishment narrative in the West. There's the establishment narrative in Russia, which isn't all that different, actually. And then there are all of these different so-called conspiracy theories. And what the truth is, only Allah knows at this point.
The reason I had my pauses in this whole situation is that the West says that Putin is a dictator. It says that Russia is not a free and fair society. And at the same time, for weeks upon weeks upon weeks, Prigozhin was taking shots at the Russian leadership constantly, openly and publicly, and there was no consequences to that. They didn't try to shut him up. They allowed him to do that as though they were priming the battlefield for something like this to take place. And I started listening to all of the different platforms on what they were saying about the situation, and their explanations were good, but still it was something that just was missing. And so this morning I was looking at Larry Johnson, a person who I've interviewed multiple times on this platform, former CIA analyst Larry Johnson. And let me just read something to you. This is the title of an article that he wrote on June 24th. Russia's Academy Award-winning performance for Best Coup, Prigozhin scores Best Actor. And in this article, excuse me, when I read it, I said that was my line of thinking, because I behind the scene I was talking to people, and I just couldn't accept what was mainstream, because it seemed like there were too many variables that were not talked about, too many variables that were omitted when discussing the situation. And this is what Larry Johnson had to say about it. He says, what if the Prigozhin coup is Mascarovka? I can't pronounce Russian, but he says, I want to explore that possibility. Earlier today, Saturday, on the East Coast of the United States, I was sketching out a piece with the catchy title, Prigozhin pushed or ploy. Well, that swell idea was blown away like the Kharkova Dam when the narrative about the Prigozhin plan to march on Moscow and personally strangle Russian Defense Minister Shoigu went full on Nadia Comaneci backflip. Prigozhin ordered his troops back to their bases, cut a deal with the president of Belarus, Alexander Lukashenko, to go into exile and will face no judicial punishment. What? No bloodshed, no miles of burning tanks, no Mussolini necktie for Vladimir Putin. What the hell? See, even he's saying the same things are going through his mind that was going through my mind. Then he says this, man, you could feel the disappointment and frustration emanating from the Washington establishment, the political equivalent of premature ejaculation. Last night, Friday, you could hear the popping of champagne corks and popcorn as media and intelligence officials huddled around computer screens awaiting images of a distraught Putin running naked away from the Kremlin. Biden and his team remind me of Wile E. Coyote in terms of the despair they suffer as they watch their harebrained scheme to catch Putin crash and burn. Now this is where he gets to start talking about the situation at hand. He says, while I cannot firmly dismiss the possibility that Prigozhin attempted this coup on his own or with the encouragement of an outside backer, I want to present the Maskarovka scenario. Let us start with these facts. The Wagner Group was established by Russian intelligence organizations and funded by the Russian government. Many in the West mistakenly believe that Prigozhin has deep pockets and is paying Wagner's bills, and despite having zero military experience, is the commander of the outfit. As the Russians say, "Niet." Number two, Russia is considered by the US and the rest of NATO as a dictatorship. Prigozhin has been shooting his mouth off for months, spouting threats against the Russian military and indirectly at Putin, but has suffered no arrests or sanctions. Does this mean Russia is not a dictatorship? Prigozhin, my screen is going black. Hold on one second. Okay. Prigozhin ostensibly launched the coup, according to his own words on Friday, because of Russian Defense Ministry hit an encampment of Wagner troops training for war with missiles, shells, and rockets. But the alleged video of the incident showed no casualties. Today, Prigozhin backed away from that claim and now insists he was just protesting the MOD's move to bring the Wagner Group into the Russian army. The Russian government waited about 12 hours before sending any police or military forces to the Wagner Group's headquarters in St. Petersburg. Little sense of urgency, right? Prigozhin reportedly ordered a column of Wagner troops to go from Rostov-on-Don to Moscow to dethrone Shoigu and maybe General Gerasimov. And then he puts a map there. He said that is a distance of 1,200 kilometers. How was that column of trucks and tanks supposed to refuel and cover that distance in less than 20 hours? Now, before we go, when he was doing this, Russia didn't feel it a threat to deploy troops. They didn't feel it a threat to deploy fighter bombers. I mean, the column of troops were left unscathed in the midst of what was being declared a coup. How does that make sense?
Yeah, so the theater interpretation is as good as any. And, I actually published an article about that yesterday, citing Pepe Escobar on why this actually is a win for Putin. And if so, who benefits, right? Cui bono. And if Putin benefits, then maybe he's behind it, right? I mean, Putin is KGB. He's Russian, he's the front man for the Russian intelligence people who said back in the 90s, okay, things have gone far enough. The country's been totally destroyed. Let's try and get it back on its feet. And of course, you can't put these kinds of deceptions past them. So yeah, that's all very possible. It's also conceivable that there are these real kinds of differences of opinion. Well, in fact, we know there are. We know, and this is the part that the Western media really leaves out, which is that Putin, by Russian standards, is a bit of a peacenik, right? Yeah. He's a moderate, but he leans towards being a peacenik. He always gives diplomacy a chance and a second chance and a third chance, and maybe more chances than he really should. He actually trusted the West in this attempt to get peace in Ukraine through the Minsk Accords. And it was only the fact that the West and of course the Ukrainian puppets that finally just made it clear that the whole purpose of the Minsk Accords was to buy enough time so that NATO could massively arm Ukraine for this war with Russia, that finally Putin gave up. So Putin's a peacenik, and his main opposition in Russia is not the pro-Western Jewish oligarchs and their friends, although that he's got most of those people he already busted and took down a peg or two. But it's really the people on the other side who say, you know, Putin, you're giving diplomacy way too many chances. You should have just nuked Kiev right away, and you should have probably nuked some sites in Poland already too. And we should have gone all out and went on a World War II footing if we're going to do this from the very beginning. So it's the hawks who are the main opposition, and the Russian people as a whole, like Putin, he's got that 70% approval rating. But to the extent that there's a threat to his power, it would come from people wanting somebody a lot more hawkish, somebody willing to fight hard to win quickly. So Putin has to worry about opposition from that quarter. So one way to try to defuse that problem would be to do the typical false opposition thing, where the best way to beat your opposition is to control it, as in 1984. And it's the same sort of thing that we've seen with the January 6th so-called insurrection, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, that January 6th insurrection was not some spontaneous uprising, dangerous uprising by Trump supporters who were going to overthrow the government, as it's been portrayed. That it was very much orchestrated and provoked and made into a spectacle by the anti-Trump forces, precisely in order to discredit them and to launch a huge crackdown on anything remotely resembling that side of the American political spectrum. And so they disabled that side of the spectrum by way of this fake insurrection on January 6, 2021. And so likewise, this could have been a sort of fake insurrection too, designed in the same way to sort of flush out everybody who would ever support this kind of thing, right? And everybody in Russia who's ready to rise up against Putin or against Putin's official military command because they're pissed off that the war's taking this long and they want a hardliner in there. So all of those people, when this happened, they started probably expressing their support or participating in it. And now the Russian government, the intelligence services, have their numbers. They know who all those people are. And so it actually plays out to stabilize the Russian government in the long run, just like the January 6th fake insurrection stabilized the current ruling regime in Washington.
And Larry Johnson, after giving us the distance of how far this convoy of trucks and tanks would have to travel, along the way, they have to be refueled, they have to be fed, and just think about this. When they went to Rostov, what is it called?
Rostov on the Don or something.
Yeah, Rostov on the Don. There was no. They went to the headquarters that was left unguarded. I mean, that was the operational center for what's going on in Ukraine, and they had no troops, no security, no nothing there. I mean, what is the certainty that a nation at war would allow the command center for operations in the war theater to have no security?
Mm-hmm.
And so he goes, go ahead.
That's sort of like we heard that the head of Blackwater during the Iraq War had been massively bad-mouthing Bush for weeks and months, and then suddenly we hear that Blackwater has taken over the U.S. Command Center for the Middle East. And is leading. They're going to all march on Washington. I was like, really? Okay.
Well, now let us look at this. He goes after showing the map of the convoy and how long it would take and the distance. He goes and he says this. He says, "How about this as an explanation? The entire coup narrative was generated to allow for the movement of Russian military forces to areas north and west of Voronezh." I can't pronounce these Russian names. I'm sorry if I'm butchering them, but without raising the alarm among NATO planners. Russia was moving forces to stop coup plotters as opposed to building up forces for a new axis of offense. What say you? And then I'll read a little bit more, but what say you on that? Because think about this. When they moved their forces, NATO didn't raise their alert status. And they moved them closer to Ukraine than they were before. So, I mean, what is your thought on it?
That sounds possible. I'm not enough of an expert on the nuts and bolts, in terms of the strategic situation on the ground to really comment on whether that's plausible or not. But just on the surface, it sounds like it could be.
And then he goes further and he says, It appears that the roots of the narrative that Prigozhin was going to betray Russia starts in 2022. Someone with ties to Western intelligence had a relationship with Prigozhin and began sounding him about, out about collaborating with the West. Prigozhin let his Russian intel bosses know about the pitch, and the Russians decided to build an op that would present Prigozhin as a disgruntled patriot, boiling in anger at the incompetence of Russian leaders. The Russians fed this by letting Prigozhin launch vicious verbal attacks on Shoigu and Gerasimov. And if we are to believe the Jack Teixeira Discord leaks, even passed intel on to the locations of Russian troops to his intel handler. Here is the interesting part of this hypothesis. Who made the decision to launch Prigozhin? A credible argument can be made that the Prigozhin's Western handlers decided that Friday was the day and ordered him into action, but I think this was stage managed in the Kremlin. Putin and his intel chiefs knew what the West was trying to foment in Russia and realized that Ukraine and NATO were reeling from their feckless counteroffensive and its attendant massive losses in men and material. Why not use the coup attempt as a good cover story for the mass movement of Russian troops all along the line between Moscow and Rostov-on-Don? This is a way to move Russian troops to areas north of Belgorod without drawing the unwelcome attention of NATO ISR platforms. Move the troops closer to the border and then disperse them, which means Russia found a way to reinforce troops on a new potential axis of attack that will create a nightmare for NATO war planners. That's what is your assessment on that thought? And he should know a little bit about this because he worked in the CIA as an intelligence agent, and he did work with people that carried out this type of operations.
Well, if Larry's right, you could say that, hey, Larry, you just alerted, the Western guys, to what the Russians are doing. You just spilled the beans. But then the more likely, Larry would know that, of course, at least some of the American and Western intelligence community would understand these things. So it's not like he's actually spilling any secrets. But again, this is the sort of stuff that has went on at Veterans Today back before we became VTForeignPolicy.com. That we were run by Gordon Duff, the ex-CIA guy, he always has to say he worked for the post office, but I can tell you it was the CIA. And these guys deal in secrets, and they relish classified information that only they have, and what's really going on, and the poor rubes think it's this, and then the other people think it's that, but we're pretty sure it's really this. So that whole world, it really always struck me as kind of humorous, and like I'm the world I come from is the world of transparency, right? The ideals of the academy and the media are transparency. We're supposed to be as transparent as possible. We're supposed to be looking for the truth. And then we're not supposed to be like holding back bits of truth and trying to sell them or share them among our side so we can win some kind of battle without telling the world about the truth. We're supposed to just blast the truth out there to everybody. And that's our job. And so that's how I see what I do. It's just what the academy and then the journalism profession are supposed to do, but rarely do. But the intelligence profession is something different. That works on, truth. It needs a gigantic bodyguard of lies, as Churchill said. And so they're playing that game. And God bless him. Larry used to play that game when he was with them, and now he purports to be on our side, telling the truth as he sees it. And he does seem to be doing that, as far as I can tell. So God bless him twice. And he's a great source. So congratulations for getting him on your show. I've had him on too. I should probably invite him back.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm just thinking because prior to this article, everybody had the same narrative, and now this morning, when you go to some of the mainstream media platforms and the alternative media platforms, some of them are now talking about this same perspective now, which was not spoken about prior to this. It's just something. It's not sitting right with me with this Prigozhin coup. How can you even think that you were going to go to Moscow and confront the defense minister and the Joint Chiefs of Staff equivalent in Russia with a because remember at first they said that what is it? The Wagner Group had shot down multiple helicopters, but then after analysis of the certain videos and stuff, they said that those were events that took place in other areas that happened a while ago. And so a lot of this stuff had been discredited. And I'm trying to figure out, if you are a head of a military unit, common sense will tell you not to launch an offensive without air cover. That's exactly what is going on in Ukraine right now. The Wagner Group with Russian air support were hammering Ukrainian forces because they had no answer to the air superiority. So why would a person that just came out of that situation then repeat the same mistakes as the opposition that they were fighting against in Ukraine and repeat it in the largest in the largest nuclear power on the planet?
Yeah, that and Prigozhin not only should know that if he's really doing a military coup where there's going to be shots fired and stuff, that he's in a situation where he can't win, but also he should know that, on the contrary, if it were designed as a kind of a psychological coup that, he wants to get Shoigu fired, for example, or, he wants to become the new right-hand man to Putin or something like that, that this wouldn't work. Because there's no way that Putin could go along with that. So if this were real, then Prigozhin would, he'd game it out ahead of time, and he'd say, okay, so we're marching on Moscow, but we're trying to be peaceful. We don't want to shed any Russian blood. Putin, please fire Shoigu. Now he's got to know that Putin can't do that. I mean, Putin would look weak if Putin were to fire Shoigu because Prigozhin is threatening him with his march on Moscow. Putin's toast, right? I mean, so of course he would never do that. So that just goes without saying. So that means, what in the world was Prigozhin thinking? What was his real end game? And the answer is that he can't really have had one. We saw that, to his credit, he didn't want to shed Russian blood. That's so okay. So he doesn't want to shed Russian blood, and if he did shed Russian blood, his would be the first that would flow. So that's a non-starter. That scenario doesn't work. As you said, there's no air cover, etc. So he's doomed if he actually wanted to fight. That couldn't. So he would have known that. So that can't have been his plan. Well, what could have been his plan? And as I said, if it's purely psychological, that if he wants to get Shoigu fired, he knows that Putin won't do that. So that makes no sense either. So what was he thinking? The only thing I could come up with is, he went crazy. He got drunk and went crazy. But more likely, as you're saying, that it's the Kabuki theater thing, or the Russian equivalent, really does make more sense. And I don't know when Larry put this out, but I know I wrote my piece raising this right out yesterday morning, right after getting an email from Kent Meyercourt, or Ken Meyercourt. Ken is the former most controversial TV talk show host in Washington, D.C. He had this cable access program where he brought on Holocaust revisionists and pro-Palestine resistance people and stuff like that. And it's great stuff. And anyway, so Ken sent me an email saying a lot of the kinds of things that you're saying, that Larry said, that this doesn't make any sense. And so I went ahead and used that as sort of the touchstone for my piece that I published yesterday. It's up today at the UNZ Review, unz.com, asking, whether this is a psyop. And then I compared it to two other psyops. One, the fake January 6th insurrection, which looks to me very similar, right?